March 19th, 1945, Western Latvia, the frozen outskirts of Saldus, inside what the maps called the Courland Pocket. A temporary runway had been scraped out of snow and churned soil. A Junkers Ju-52 sat at the far end with its engines coughing and sputtering, warming up for a takeoff that might never happen. Captain Klaus von Stauffen pushed through a crowd of men who smelled of wet wool and kerosene. Feldgendarmerie with gorgets on their chests kept the line straight with hard looks and submachine guns. At a fuel drum under a hooded lantern, an SS-Brigadeführer named Heinrich pressed a stamp down onto a boarding list as if ink could hold back artillery. Names were being turned into seats, seats into life. Klaus stopped where he could read without being noticed. Heinrich's gloved finger slid down the page, pausing, skipping, landing on a line and tapping once. Approval, denial, approval. In that moment, the war was not a front line. It was a document, and the man who controlled it. Klaus felt the Volta in his holster like a stone. He could have drawn it and ended Heinrich right there in front of witnesses with the plane whining behind them. But he saw the SS guards, the Feldgendarmerie, the men who still believed the stamp was the only law left. A shot would bring a dozen more, and the first people to pay would not be Heinrich's escorts. They would be the ones hidden under Klaus's protection. He stepped back into the dark and let the cold steady his breathing. Courland, in March of 1945, was a corner of Europe that refused to stop bleeding. The German forces in the Baltics had been cut off months earlier and compressed against the sea. 6 times the Red Army had tried to break the pocket open. The 6th offensive was rolling now, pressing along the Saldus-Blyden line, where rail beds and narrow roads guided armor through forests and bogs. From Klaus's sector, the landmarks were not villages on a peacetime map. They were scars. Blyden station was a smashed knot of rails and burned wagons where the embankment still made a straight, stubborn line through the woods. The manor at Blyden had lost windows and roof tiles, but its stone foundation held, and wounded men were still dragged into its cellars because the walls did not care whose flag flew overhead. In Courland, even ruins became fortifications when there was nowhere else to go. Klaus served with the 121st Infantry Division, a unit that still existed because surrender had not yet reached them on paper. Orders still came down through Corps and Army headquarters. Maps still had neat symbols. Men still stood watch in the snow and pretended that procedure meant control. Klaus kept his part of that pretense. Every morning he walked the trench line and checked rifles, bolts clean, firing pins dry, magazines free of ice. The habit was older than the pocket, older than Heinrich. A soldier with a working weapon could at least choose how he died. In his inner pocket he carried a small cross of black metal edged in white, worn smooth where his father's thumb had rubbed it for years. His father had been a general in the same division, a hard man with a soft spot for discipline. He had died suddenly. Heart trouble, the doctor had said, only weeks before. The cross was what had been left behind, along with a vacant chair and an unease Klaus could not name. That unease took a shape the day Heinrich arrived. Heinrich came to Klaus's dugout with an escort in camouflage smocks and clean gloves. He spoke politely, as if they were meeting in an office rather than a half-buried hole. He placed a folder on Klaus's table and opened it to a typed directive. Before any withdrawal, local laborers and unreliable elements were to be liquidated. No names yet, only categories. The language was cold and careful, the kind meant to sound like housekeeping. Klaus asked for the issuing authority, the order number, the boundary of responsibility between Wehrmacht and SS. Heinrich smiled like a man being entertained. He didn't answer the questions. He simply watched Klaus, weighing him. The first test came the next day in a whiteout. Soviet reconnaissance pushed hard near Blyden, probing along the rail embankment and through the stands of fir. The sound of machine guns was muffled by snow, as if the forest itself were trying to hide what was happening. Klaus followed his forward platoon toward Blyden, a manor house that had become a shelter for wounded and a landmark for everyone moving in that sector. An outbuilding near the manor had been shredded by shellfire. Inside, in the dim light, Klaus found 3 Latvian women in nurse aprons and a boy pressed against a fallen beam. An SS corporal stood over them with a rifle. Heinrich was there too, calm, as if watching a demonstration. Heinrich said nothing at first. He let Klaus see the boy's face, the nurse's hands, the corporal's stance. Then he nodded once. The corporal raised his rifle. Klaus stepped between them. He shouted that Soviet scouts were close, and noise discipline mattered. He ordered the corporal to move them back to cover. The corporal hesitated and looked to Heinrich. For a long second, the only sound was the wind and distant gunfire. Then Heinrich's eyes narrowed, and he gave the smallest possible motion with his hand. Permission to delay, not permission to spare. Klaus grabbed the boy and pulled him away, the nurses stumbling after. He did not run toward his own men. He ran toward the manor's stone foundation, where a cellar door gaped open like a mouth. Inside, the cellar smelled of damp earth and old potatoes. Klaus shoved crates aside and made a hollow in the shadows. He gave the nurses a tin of meat and his own ration bread, food he could not afford to lose. The boy ate without speaking, staring at Klaus as if trying to decide what kind of German he was. Klaus turned the hiding place into a routine because only routine kept panic quiet. He sent his communications runner, Eric, after dark with water. He ordered spruce branches dragged across the snow to smear footprints. He chose one sentry to watch the cellar door, an older man who still cleaned his rifle without being told. Each choice bought time. Each choice also left a trace. That evening, Heinrich sat in Klaus's dugout as if he had always belonged there. He asked, in a tone that sounded almost curious, whether Klaus believed mercy was a military resource. Klaus answered with the words officers used when they wanted to sound sensible: security, order, prevention of partisan activity. Heinrich listened. Then he said, softly, that in Courland there would be no partisans left if there were no civilians left. Klaus did not reply. He watched the lamp flame waver, and he felt the pocket tighten around his throat. The truth about his father arrived on a stretcher. Otto Schmidt, his father's longtime adjutant, was carried into the dugout with blood at the corner of his mouth. The old man's lungs were failing. He pressed an oilcloth packet into Klaus's hand and motioned him closer. Inside the packet was a small glass vial with a bitter almond smell and a torn corner of a typed document. Otto whispered that Klaus's father had refused to sign a liquidation order. He had argued that killing laborers in Courland would stain the division and ignite hatred that would outlive the war. Otto whispered that Heinrich had visited the general the night before the heart attack, dismissed the doctor, and insisted on bringing the general a drink. Otto's eyes held Klaus's as if demanding an answer, not a comfort. Klaus felt his father's cross bite into his palm. He pictured Heinrich at the fuel drum, stamping names into life. He pictured the cellar under the manor, the boys' silent chewing, the nurses' hollow faces. He did not draw his pistol. If he killed Heinrich openly, the SS would scour the manor and shoot everyone under it. If he waited, the stamp would keep moving down the list, and the liquidation order would become a line of bodies. Klaus sat beside Otto until the old man's breathing turned into a rattle and stopped. Outside, the snow kept falling, steady and indifferent, covering tracks for a few minutes at a time before the next bootprint cut through it again. Klaus began to gather proof the way a front-line officer could. With hurried questions, borrowed notebooks, and whatever paper survived the burn pit. At the battalion aid post, he asked for his father's last medical entries. The medic's face tightened before he handed over a thin notebook. Klaus read the handwriting and found a gap where the night should have been. He saw the doctor's signature repeated in a way that looked practiced, not natural. He went to the field telephone exchange and asked the switchboard clerk whether any calls had been held open the night the general died. The clerk admitted, quietly, that a line had been kept busy for an unusually long time without a recorded connection, as if someone had wanted the trace to vanish. Klaus did not speak of murder in the open. He spoke of irregularities. He spoke of missing paperwork. In a normal army, that language brought inspectors. In Courland, it brought hunters. He sent Eric to the headquarters, burn pit after dark. Eric returned with ash-stained scraps and the smell of smoke on his coat. Among the scraps was part of a typed page with the word liquidation still readable and a fragment of an official header, enough to show that someone had tried to erase the order's existence without erasing its intent. While Klaus gathered paper, Heinrich gathered control. Feld gendarmerie patrols began to appear at road junctions that had been unguarded a week earlier. A new SS command post was set up near the ruins of Bliden station, close enough that the engines and shouted orders carried through the trees at night. Men who used to answer to Klaus started asking whether they should also report to the other headquarters. Then came the rumor that sharpened everything. An aviation non-commissioned officer named Rolf arrived at Klaus's position to requisition manpower to keep the runway usable. His hands were raw from working in the cold. He told Klaus there would be one Ju-52 lift if the weather and the Soviet artillery allowed it. One flight to carry staff officers, specialists, and the men whose names could be justified on a list. Klaus understood why Heinrich's stamp mattered so much. In a shrinking world, the list was the last form of power. Klaus returned to the manor cellar that night. The nurses were thinner already. Their breath hung in the candlelight. Ilse, the one who spoke German best, told Klaus about fishermen who sometimes slipped across the Baltic in darkness toward neutral Sweden, and about a forester's hut west along the Blidene-Remte road, where a Red Cross cloth had once been left as a signal. She did not promise anything, she only offered a direction. Klaus asked for details because details were the only kind of hope he trusted. Ilse described a bend in the road marked by a stand of birches, pale trunks like a fence. She described a hut with a sagging roof and a scar on its door where an axe had struck. She described a man who sometimes waited there, a local guide if he had not been arrested or shot. Klaus left the cellar with a plan that felt as thin as paper. He tried to buy time by giving Heinrich something else to chase. Klaus studied the terrain between his sector and a Soviet reconnaissance corridor his scouts had reported on. He proposed a reconnaissance in force to probe the corridor, hinting that it might reveal a weakness or yield prisoners. Heinrich agreed instantly. He did not mind using Wehrmacht men as the lead edge. They moved under a low grey sky. Snow crust cracked under boots. Soviet fire found them quickly, machine gun tracers through trees, then mortar rounds thumping into the frozen earth. At one point Heinrich dismounted, furious, and stepped into the open to shout orders. Klaus raised his rifle and let the sight settle on Heinrich's chest. The shot would have been easy. Then Klaus saw the mortar line walking its impacts closer, adjusting toward the manor's direction where the wounded and civilians hid. If the SS scattered, the mortars would chase movement the way mortars always did. The shelling would drift. The cellar would not withstand it. Klaus lowered the rifle and threw smoke grenades instead, dragging his men back along a route that kept the mortar impacts short of the manor. When they returned, Heinrich looked at Klaus for a long time. He asked almost gently whether Klaus had ever hunted as a boy and whether he knew what hesitation did to prey. Klaus answered with talk of cohesion and withdrawal routes. Heinrich smiled as if he had heard the truth anyway. The second crack came from inside Klaus's own battalion. A sergeant approached him with careful politeness and mentioned that rations were disappearing. Footprints had been seen near the manor at odd hours. The sergeant's eyes did not meet Klaus's. Klaus understood the bargain already forming in that man's mind, a secret in exchange for a seat on the plane. Klaus did not arrest him. An arrest would split the unit and force the issue before Klaus had moved the civilians. Instead, he let the sergeant see the ash-stained paper scrap with the word liquidation still visible. He asked whether the sergeant recognized the look of an official header. The sergeant went pale. He backed away without another word. It was not enough. On the night of March 19th, fighting flared hard near Blidene station. The ground carried the sound of engines, tracked vehicles, heavier than anything Klaus had left. Runners reported that Latvian SS volunteers were being pulled toward the station area for a counter-attack, that the railbed had become a guide for armor in the darkness. In the chaos, Heinrich arrived at the manor with a search party. He claimed he was securing medical supplies before a withdrawal. Klaus met him outside the cellar door. The wind blew snow into their faces. Heinrich's escort watched Klaus's hands. Heinrich did not search blindly. He produced a ring. Klaus recognized it immediately, his family ring kept with his father's letters. Someone had taken it from his things. Someone close enough to touch his life had sold him. Heinrich held the ring between thumb and forefinger like a coin. He said softly that the ring corresponded to an account in Switzerland. He said the old general had prepared an exit. He said Klaus would hand over the ring, and in return Heinrich would delay the liquidation order for the local laborers and the people Klaus had chosen to shelter. Klaus felt the picture form in his mind. The Jew 52, the stamp, the list. He felt the temptation to bargain, not for money, but for time. He refused. He refused loudly enough that witnesses would hear only an administrative argument, documents, authority, coordination with sector command. He turned blackmail into bureaucracy. Heinrich's eyes promised payment. The payment came at dawn. Otto Schmidt was dragged into the open near the manor wall, hands tied, face bruised. An SS officer read charges of defeatism and collaboration as if reciting a weather report. Klaus tried to speak, tried to invoke jurisdiction, tried to claim his father's division had its own authority. No one listened. The men who formed the ring around Otto were not all SS. Some wore Wehrmacht field grey with tired faces, and they kept their eyes forward the way men do when they are being forced to pretend they agree. A clerk held a folder. An officer held a stamp. The whole thing was built to look official because an official killing was easier to live with than a naked one. Klaus heard someone behind him whisper Otto's name like a prayer, and then fall silent when a felled gendarmerie boot shifted in warning. Otto's last look at Klaus was not fear. It was a hard disappointment, as if he were asking why Klaus had still not acted. A single shot ended Otto, and the body slumped into the snow. Heinrich turned to Klaus and stripped him of command with a piece of paper and a signature. Feldgendarmerie took Klaus's sidearm and his papers. He was marched to a shattered farmhouse and locked inside, the windows covered with blankets. From that room, Klaus could hear the pocket collapsing, engines moving, men shouting, rockets whining in the distance. He took his father's cross out of his pocket and held it until his palm hurt. He thought of the cellar. He thought of the boy. He thought of Otto. He understood that waiting had become its own form of complicity. Klaus listened for routine, because routine was the one weakness even armed men allowed themselves. The guards outside his door walked a pattern. Their boots scuffed at the same point on the floor. Their voices rose and fell in the same bored rhythm. Near midnight, Eric arrived carrying a bucket of water. He did not speak. He set the bucket down with a deliberate slosh, and Klaus saw a small key taped underneath. When the wind rose and the artillery noise covered small sounds, Klaus used the key. He eased the door open and stepped into the corridor. A guard's rifle leaned against the wall. Klaus took it, struck the guard with the butt hard enough to drop him, and dragged him into the room. He did not fire. A gunshot would have woken the whole line. He slipped out into the night, low and fast, and found Eric waiting with a truck that used to haul ammunition. The engine complained when it turned over, then caught. They drove toward the manor with the headlights covered. Snow made the road edges glow faintly. In the distance, fires flickered behind low clouds. At the cellar door, Klaus knocked the pattern Ilse had taught him. The door opened, and the smell of damp earth rolled out. Klaus did not waste time on reassurance. He ordered the civilians into the truck, lifted a wounded woman onto the empty crates, wrapped the boy in a blanket taken from a German bed. Before he climbed into the cab, he took out the ring. For a moment he imagined crushing it under his boot and ending the temptation forever. Instead, he pressed it into Ilse's palm with the ash-stained paper scrap and the small vial. "Keep it," he told her. "If they stop you, hide it." Ilse nodded once, face tight with fear and determination. They rolled onto the Bleedny-Remt road. because there was no other line through the forest that a truck could manage. The first checkpoint appeared at a crossroads. 2 Feldgendarmerie stepped into the road with a flashlight and a submachine gun. Klaus slowed, leaned out the window, and shouted that he was carrying wounded to the rear because the station fighting had overwhelmed the aid posts. The flashlight beam swept the truck bed. It caught the boy's face for a heartbeat. Suspicion hardened. The guard raised his weapon. Klaus chose speed. He slammed the accelerator. The truck surged forward, forcing the men to jump aside. Gunfire cracked behind them. Bullets punched into the wood, sending splinters into the air. They did not stay on the main road. Klaus turned onto a logging track under fir trees, the truck skidding as the tires fought for grip. Behind them, an engine revved and headlights flared through branches. Klaus drove by feel, guided by the pale trunks of birches when they appeared. Ilse's marker, the bend like a white fence. He cut the engine near the forester's hut and let the truck settle into silence. The hut looked abandoned, the way everything in that pocket looked abandoned. Used until it broke, then left to freeze. Its door hung crooked, and a faded strip of cloth with a red cross had once been nailed there, now torn and flapping like a surrender flag no one trusted. Klaus could smell old smoke and damp pine needles when he stepped down from the cab. In the distance, the wind carried something else too, a faint salt edge from the Baltic, more memory than promise. For a few seconds there was only the sound of breathing and the distant thump of artillery. A vehicle passed on the main road, men shouting in German. Klaus heard Heinrich's name used like an oath. Ilse touched Klaus's arm and pointed. A Latvian man in a worn coat emerged from the trees, hands raised, a scrap of cloth with a red cross tied to his sleeve. He spoke quickly to Ilse in Latvian. She translated. He could lead them farther west, toward the coast, where fishermen sometimes moved people at night. Nothing was promised. The Soviets were coming too. Patrols hunted anyone who looked out of place. Klaus made the choice he had been building toward since the runway. He ordered the civilians out of the truck and into the trees with the guide. He told Ilse to keep the ring and the papers no matter what. He told Erich to help the wounded move without noise. The boy clutched Klaus's sleeve. Klaus pried the small fingers loose without speaking. He could not afford tenderness that might make him hesitate again. When the last figure vanished into the dark, Klaus climbed back into the cab with Erich. Erich looked at him, waiting for the order to keep running. Klaus turned the truck back toward the runway. They left the truck behind a wrecked wagon and approached on foot. The Ju-52's engines were running at a high pitch now, ready. Then came the sharper sound of rockets, the rising whistle that meant Katyusha salvos were walking in. The first rockets struck near the far end of the runway, tearing the ground open and throwing ice and dirt into the air. Men scattered, shouting. A hangar wall caught fire and burned fast, the canvas roof collapsing in sparks. In the chaos, Heinrich moved toward the aircraft with his guards, a leather case in his hand and the boarding list tucked under his arm. He walked like a man who believed the stamp was still stronger than steel. Klaus stepped onto the runway's far end and raised the Walter he had taken back during his escape. He did not deliver a speech. He held the pistol steady with both hands and waited for Heinrich to look at him. Heinrich halted, irritation on his face more than surprise. He spoke one sentence, an offer, a seat on the plane if Klaus lowered the gun. Klaus fired once, aiming center mass the way soldiers are trained. Heinrich staggered and dropped the leather case. Guards swung their rifles toward Klaus. Klaus dove behind a crater lip as bullets snapped past. Another rocket salvo struck closer. The blast wave knocked men down. In that staggered moment, Klaus rose to one knee and fired again. Heinrich collapsed fully, coat darkening against the snow. For a heartbeat, no one moved, as if waiting for the stamp to tell them what came next. Then the runway returned to chaos, shouting, scrambling, men pushing toward the aircraft door. Klaus crawled to Heinrich's fallen case and forced it open. Inside were papers, a stamp, and foreign banknotes wrapped in oilcloth. Klaus took the stamp and crushed it under his boot until the metal bent. He shoved the case into a fire burning near the runway edge and watched the papers curl and blacken. The Ju-52 began its takeoff run. It hit a crater edge, bounced, and for a moment looked too heavy to lift. Then it clawed into the air, clearing the treetops by what felt like inches, engines screaming into the low cloud. Klaus watched it go without moving. He walked away from the runway and sat beside a burning hangar wall where the heat could reach his hands. He found a cigarette in his pocket and lit it from a glowing shard of wood. Smoke filled his lungs, harsh and familiar. Beyond the fires, the frozen ground carried a steady, heavy clank, the sound of tracked vehicles approaching. Klaus did not need a report to name it. He had heard it in other countries and other winters. T-34s were coming over the horizon. He took his father's cross out of his tunic and held it in the firelight until the black metal glowed faintly at the edges. He did not imagine it could clean what had happened. He treated it like embers, the last heat of a code that had failed to stop men like Heinrich, but had still guided him to pull a boy out of a firing line and send a nurse into the woods with proof in her hand. He inhaled the last of the cigarette and pressed it into the snow until it hissed out. Somewhere west along the Blidene-Remte road, Ilse carried a ring, a vial, and scraps of paper that smelled of smoke. She would have to keep moving, keep hiding, keep trusting a guide who might be brave or desperate or both. Klaus could not follow her. He could only believe that sending her away before firing on the runway had been the one decision that mattered. Shells landed closer. Snow jumped in white bursts. Klaus sat straighter against the burning wall and waited, empty-handed now except for the iron cross warming in his palm.